Americans were encouraged to give up things in order to support soldiers serving abroad during World War II. Individuals took on new domestic duties, altered their diets, and changed occupations. While everyone else tightened their belts and found ways to get by, the troops enjoyed the best food. However, rather than complaining, people became inventive. Okay, get your bib. It's time to chow down on some World War II. The U.S. administration soon realized that the armed forces would be in competition with the civilian population for resources including food, metal, rubber, paper, and other things as World War II intensified. A system of rationing was put in place to guarantee that the military forces had access to the supplies they needed to win the war. This is how it transpired. Every person, both adults and children, received a set amount of points from the government. Afterwards, those points would have to be used in addition to cash to purchase any item prohibited for use in the war effort. For instance, in 1943, the monetary value of approximately 30 cents for a pound of bacon was augmented by 7 points. The government will give out stamps in the form of points in books. Volunteers from the Office of Price Administration, or OPA, would hand out the books and provide retailers and customers alike an explanation of their function. Tires were the first thing to be rationed, then cars, and finally fuel. Subsequently, in May 1942, the government started listing food items on the list, including coffee and sugar. A few months later, cheeses, canned milk, meats, fish, and fats were also considered off-limits. Hoarders would empty the stores whenever a new item was added to the list, causing shortages. Many of the prohibited items would inevitably be sold on the black market. Still, the system worked rather effectively, in spite of these issues. America's European allies likewise placed similar limitations in their native countries. People would need to get inventive in the kitchen because so many necessities were rationed, simple and delicious. Sponge cake has been around since the Renaissance, despite the fact that many people are unaware of this fact. Its deliciousness and ease of preparation are the key to its longevity, but soldiers' strong demand for the ingredients, flour, sugar, butter, and eggs, during World War II, contributed to its shortage. Especially scarce in food stores worldwide were eggs and sugar. The Welsh take on sponge cake required a lot of milk, syrup, and margarines, but no eggs. Usually the 2 layers of cake were covered with jam in the center. Even if it wasn't as fluffy as what people are used to these days, when cooked correctly, it nevertheless acquired a golden tone. A startling 25% of Poland's population perished in the battle during World War II. The Polish people had to make the most of what little food they still had, because the Germans had taken all of their land. But not all of the meals were boring affairs. For example, potato flour sour cream was designed to go well with the blueberry dumplings, a beloved dish among Polish kids. The ingredients for the sour cream were milk, sugar, and potato flour, a combination that some of you have probably noticed is identical to a typical whipped cream recipe. Growing up outside of Warsaw, Maria Karpowiczowa gathered Polish recipes from World War II. The kids indulged themselves because they can cover the dumplings with a copious amount of the cream, instead of the potato flour sour cream. Cooks in England try their best to maintain a semblance of normalcy in their diets. They fried what became known as imitation fish fillets as one method of doing this. The fillets were prepared with rice, just like regular fish fillets. They combined rice and egg in a pan of fried rice that was half an inch thick, cooled it, and then sliced it into the shape of fake fish fillets. If bread was available, they breaded the fillets. They were then deep fried once more until they looked golden. Meat was in high demand during World War II, as one might expect. Most of the beef went to those fighting on the front lines. Therefore, things at home had to change. Advertisers began posting vegetarian recipes, such as creamed eggs over pancakes and walnut cheese patties, while restaurants began implementing meatless menus on specific days of the week. On the other hand, home cooks began devising inventive and captivating methods to enhance the limited ingredients they possessed, or they simply came up with brand new recipes. For instance, meatloaf which was made with ground beef and other ingredients, and cooked into a loaf, was a common dish in the early 20th century. However, in an effort to save money during World War II, chefs started using vegetables in place of other ingredients. This loaf has a can of condensed tomato soup, a cup of mashed potatoes, and peas instead of ground beef. Although it wasn't exactly the same as a real meatloaf, it was a useful method to use leftovers and obtain some vegetables. Using leftovers to extend the life of food was a major component of rationing. As a result, many meals were essentially assembled from leftovers. For example, there was no set formula for bubble and squeak, but there was one essential ingredient: mashed potatoes. Potatoes were easy to raise, therefore, they remained commonly available during the rationing period. The best thing about them from a cooking standpoint was that they absorbed whatever flavors were pressed into them. Mashed potatoes, when used in bubble and squeak, transformed every dinner into a type of potato pancake, typically stuffed with whatever meat and vegetables were available. Without flour, baking may seem nearly impossible. However, when supplies of this staple were limited, residents in occupied Poland came up with inventive ways to get by. This frequently meant substituting beans for flour. Beans, of course, don't taste or feel like flour, but they can be incorporated into a cake and made more pliable by mashing and boiling them. Additionally, beans have an earthy flavor rather than anything like flour. However, the inventive Polish cooks also found a solution for that. Specifically, the recipe called for 6 teaspoons of sugar, so it was probably rather sweet. During World War II, vegetables were abundant in America, primarily due to their inability to be supplied to the soldiers. Americans were advised to eat enough of fresh produce because it was impossible to carry fresh fruit and vegetables abroad without them becoming bad. The government eventually went so far as to encourage people to start their own victory gardens, claiming that by allowing people to cultivate and can their own vegetables, more industrial space would have become available for war-related goods. One of the best examples of a vegetable that was both incredibly robust and simple to grow were onions. Additionally, chefs started stuffing them with other contents in the 1940s. Back then, grape nuts, a bland, ear-piercing cereal that incidentally is made of wheat and barley rather than grapes or nuts, were a staple in American culture. This cereal still has applications in the kitchen, despite the fact that most people still think it's tasteless. It did, for starters, give stuffed onions a consistency akin to that of an onion filled with ground beef. This recipe tastes great when the spices are just perfect. For many people, coffee is a necessity. However, practically all American coffee beans were transferred overseas during World War II, making coffee one of the most difficult foods to ration. It may seem like the worst nightmare in the modern world, with a Starbucks somewhere on every corner. But Americans were only allowed to drink 1 pound of coffee every 5 to 6 weeks. This indicated that they were consuming fewer than 1 cup per day. The terror. Roosevelt coffee, named for President Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the time, was first made by Americans who felt they had to have a cup of joe. Roast coffee grounds were all that went into making Roosevelt coffee. Although people got creative with it, it was usually somewhat watery and probably only a passable replacement for the genuine thing. There were occasions when pastum and chicory were combined with coffee, while pastum, a coffee alternative composed of wheat molasses, maltodextrin, and wheat bran, provided spice to the coffee. The tongue of a cow is large, rough, and rubbery. If given any other choice, it's not exactly something that the average American family would sit down to enjoy. However, American households were limited to purchasing meat supplies during World War II, such as tongue and feet, which led to creative alterations on traditional recipes. For example, beef tongue was not merely served as a large tongue on a dish. Rather, it was served in a form more like to a casserole. You'll be familiar with braised beef tongue. A contemporary recipe includes tomato sauce, carrots, onions, and celery, in addition to the tongue. The tongue has to be cooked for 2 hours and then baked in the casserole with vegetables for an additional 2 hours to get it to a palatable consistency, though the dish itself isn't particularly appetizing. The name spit soup isn't the most inviting in culinary history. In occupied Poland, The soup was invented as a means to use up extra barley. Many of the items that contributed so much to Polish cuisine were no longer available to Poles. Simple foods like chestnuts were forbidden, as were proteins like oysters and anchovies. Thus, barley, a substantial cereal, was used to make soup by Poles in order to survive World War II. But why did they call the meal by such an ugly moniker? It all started when they had to spit out the husks as they were eating the soup. This classic Jewish recipe for chopped liver fortifies the chopped liver, which makes up most of the dish, with schmaltz and gribinis, or chicken fat and cracklings. Jewish families were urged to extend their food rations during World War II by preparing vegetarian meals or adding breadcrumbs to meals. This dish, served vegetarian style, was created with whatever was growing in victory gardens together with fresh fruits and vegetables. In place of the meat, home cooks frequently used green beans, peas, onions, crackers, and, if eggs were available, hard-boiled eggs. Most likely you're thinking that sawdust, in this case, refers to a certain meal. However, it's not. It's just sawdust. Nothing special. As you can see, during World War II, residents of England and Germany did not have access to the enormous wheat fields that Americans did. Thus, they combined what little they had with real sawdust, also known as tree flour in euphemism terms. Half rye grain, 2 parts sliced beets, 2 parts sawdust, and 1 part minced leaves and straw were called for in one German recipe for black bread. Everything was combined and cooked as usual. Although that doesn't sound very appetizing. You eat whatever you have to in order to survive during a conflict.